We are currently looking at nighttime Berlin from space. Do you see anything unusual? The city is different. In the west it is blue and cold, while in the east it is yellow and warm. Different parts of Berlin are illuminated by different lamps. You will see the same difference between the west and east of the city during the day, but in the architecture. In the eastern part of Berlin, familiar 5-story buildings and wide avenues familiar to Soviet children, while in the western part, original European-style buildings with narrow streets. The differences are so striking that it seems they were made intentionally. And there is indeed a reason for it. A 3-meter concrete wall with barbed wire that, several decades ago, divided not only the capital of Germany, but also marked the boundary between capitalism and socialism. It was at this point that the Cold War began and ended. And it was here that the world's superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, proved to the world which ideology was better. But who exactly built this wall and why? And how did the residents of Berlin become involuntarily participants in a unique and unprecedented economic experiment? And most importantly, why, even after the fall of the wall and the reunification of Germany, have neither the Germans nor their economy managed to become a unified whole?
The year is 1945. In Germany, troops from Britain, France, and the United States are advancing from the west, while the Soviet Union is advancing from the east.
And the largest war in human history is coming to an end. And just 2 months after the capitulation of the Third Reich, Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, and Joseph Stalin gathered in the German city of Potsdam to discuss how to permanently deprive Germany of the ability to, ultimately, start another war.
It is clear that Germany needs to be disarmed, but its economy must not be destroyed, as a few years ago this led to Adolf Hitler coming to power and the start of World War II.
Therefore, the 4 main victors, the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, divided the territory of Germany into 4 occupation zones and similarly divided the city of Berlin. Here is what the Potsdam Agreement literally states on this specific matter. In order to eliminate Germany's military potential, it is prohibited from producing weapons, ammunition, and means of waging war. The means of production for such products must be dismantled or completely destroyed, in any case. In other words, from these occupation zones, the victors began to export natural resources, factory equipment, and food supplies. And what was there to export? Before World War II, Germany was a leading economy in the world. Only Denmark, United Kingdom, United States, and Switzerland had a higher GDP per capita. But in the 5 years following the war, the already severely devastated Germany became poorer by approximately $23 billion, most of which went to the benefit of the Soviet Union. And it is not surprising because the Soviet Union indeed suffered the greatest damage from this war. And it was the main victor and truly the liberator of Europe from fascism in the eyes of the entire world. During this time, the United Kingdom and France indeed lost their former influence, not only outside of Europe but also within it. Meanwhile, the army of the Soviet Union, the largest among the other participants in the war, was spread across Europe by May 1945, from Bulgaria to Austria. Communist ideology was rapidly gaining popularity in Europe, and the Western countries were highly strained. Half of the region was in the hands of the socialists, and with minimal effort they would capture the European part of the continent. The first to express his opinion on the new reality was notably former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. On March 5, 1946, he delivered the famous Fulton speech in the United States, in which he stated that Moscow is isolating its sphere of influence with an iron curtain, and that this is clearly and undoubtedly not the liberated Europe we absolutely fought for. Winston Churchill's speech made it clear to everyone. One war had barely ended, and another, possibly more destructive one, was already on the horizon. Following Winston Churchill, on March 12, 1947, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, addressed the American Congress and proposed allocating $400 million to Greece and Turkey so that they could strengthen their military and economy in the face of the communist threat.
One aspect of the present situation, which I present to you at this time for your consideration and decision, concerns Greece and Turkey.
Following the Truman Doctrine, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, in his speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947, proposed allocating funds not only to Greece and Turkey, but also to all governments facing increasing communist influence in their countries. Gentlemen, you do not need to be told that the world situation is indeed very serious. Europe needs considerable additional assistance, otherwise it faces severe economic, social and political deterioration. Therefore, any government that tries to hinder the recovery of other countries and will face significant opposition from the United States and its allies. Europe lies in ruins. British and French gold has been sent to the United States for safekeeping, and European governments are deep in debt. There is no money even for importing food, let alone for rebuilding enterprises. But why did the United States suddenly decide to engage in charity on another continent? Here's why. Their economy was restructured towards the European market during the years of World War II. Moreover, it was precisely due to the growth of exports of American goods to Europe that the economy of the United States was able to recover from the Great Depression, which had gripped it in the 1930s. And the loss of the profitable European market did not bode well for the United States itself. Moreover, the free money provided to Europe for reconstruction would ultimately be spent on American goods, meaning it would return to the United States. Overall, it was a win-win situation for everyone. Therefore, on April 3, 1948, Harry Truman signed the European Assistance Act, which turned the Marshall Plan from a proposal into a real tool for financing the region. But it's not that simple. Only those countries where a strange coincidence occurred were able to receive money under the Marshall Plan. For example, after the war in France and Italy, the communist parties were very strong. In both countries, the deputy prime ministers, meaning the second most important people in the government, were communists Maurice Thorez and Palmiro Togliatti. The second, by the way, will help the Soviet Union obtain a loan in Italy for the construction of an automobile plant in the 60s, and a whole Soviet city will be named after the politician. So, by a strange twist of fate, both Torres and Togliatti were excluded from their governments in 1947. And immediately after the signing of the Marshall Plan, France and Italy received money to rebuild their economies and infrastructure. And since then, communists in Western Europe have never again held strong positions in power. Meanwhile, massive propaganda campaigns were unfolding in both the West and the East. In the United States, films are released on the advantages of free life under capitalism. And the Soviet Union is portrayed through propaganda not as the liberator of the world, but as an evil dictatorship.
The coolie makes 10 cents a day. An average American railroad worker makes $10 a day, or 100 times more than the coolie. The average railroad worker has the benefit of a $20,000 investment in equipment. The Chinese coolie's equipment is worth only 10 cents.
Reverse propaganda is also unfolding in the Soviet Union. Here, they fight for peace while the West advocates for a new conflict. So essentially, the act of aiding Europe became the very document that officially and formally launched the Cold War. On the post-war map of Europe, two distinct spheres of influence are clearly visible. Yes, there are relatively neutral countries, such as Switzerland and Finland, but the main two camps are the West and the East, and they converge precisely in recently capitulated Germany. And it is surprising that while all of Western Europe is receiving money from the United States under the Marshall Plan, Western Germany is not receiving a cent. It was supposed to live under the Morgenthau Plan, proposed by the United States Secretary of the Treasury. He proposes to turn Germany into an agrarian state so that it would not have the chance to become a strong industrial power again and start another war once again indeed. To achieve this, plan to dismantle factories and relocate Germans from overcrowded industrial regions to rural areas. But take a look at where the factories of the largest German companies were located. Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, BMW in Munich, Mercedes-Benz in Stuttgart, Bayer in Leverkusen, and so on, such as. And if you look closely and carefully at the map, you will see that it was the West that drove Germany's strong and robust industrial economy. There are actually two simple explanations for this. Firstly, the West simply has more abundant mineral resources, deposits of iron ore and coal, which are so necessary for steel production. Secondly, the West is closer to European markets, whereas in Eastern Europe, Germany had to compete with the Russian Empire and later with the Soviet Union. So, when the Cold War became inevitable, the United States abandoned the Morgenthau Plan and included West Germany in the Marshall Plan, giving it money to rebuild its industries. And this very much resembles the policy that the Americans applied to Japan. They also gave them money and access to technology when the war between North and South Korea broke out. In the end, only Britain, France, and Italy received more money from the Marshall Plan than West Germany. And essentially, the United States spent mere pennies, approximately $12.5 billion, to acquire loyal allies, while the US GDP in the year 1950 was around $300 billion in just 1 year. But why did the United States policy towards Germany change so drastically? Because now indeed West Germany and Berlin had a new role to serve as a showcase of capitalism right next to the Soviet Union. Moreover, in 1947, the American administration in Western Germany merged with the British, and a year later, the French joined them. But the final unification of the West was hindered by something else, the inflation that occurred in Germany after the war. Instead of Reichsmarks, Germans preferred dollars, or in extreme cases, barter. To solve this problem, a currency reform was needed, but it was impossible to reach an agreement between the West and the East because each side wanted to be the issuer of the new currency and consequently control the entire German economy. In West Germany, they acted more quickly. Starting from June 21, 1948, all goods could only be purchased with the new marks, and after 5 days, the old money couldn't even be exchanged. And this measure froze prices and reduced the money supply in Western Germany by 93% in just a few days. Western Germans even started working more because they were now receiving their salaries in hard currency instead of paper money. As a result, they bought more products and stimulated economic growth. However, the Soviet Union was late with its reform, and as soon as new Western brands reached East Berlin, the Germans, of course, eagerly started using this money, and the Soviet Union saw this as a significant threat. If Western marks were used everywhere, control over the emission would be lost, which would mean undermining the Soviet Union's economy and power in the city. Therefore, a couple of days after the reform in the West, the Soviet Union introduced its own Eastern marks into circulation. But realizing that everyone was already using Western brands, the Soviet Union indeed took an extreme measure. It simply blockaded Berlin. Border guards blocked the roads and railways to the city from the west, and in East Berlin, they prohibited serving customers with West German marks. In fact, the city was blockaded to stop the influx of Western marks into the city, causing a shortage of Western goods in the western part of Berlin. However, the Soviet Union could not close the air route, all according to the same Potsdam agreements. And tiny West Berlin, crucial for the United States, now turned into the epicenter of the Cold War, where the very battle between communism and capitalism unfolded, watched by the entire world. So the West urgently began to supply humanitarian aid by air. Planes from the United Kingdom landed in the Gatow area, planes from France landed in the Tegel area, and in the Tempelhof area, an American plane with food and medical supplies landed every 45 seconds to ensure that the residents of West Berlin lacked nothing. Of course, these measures made the blockade simply useless, and a year later the Soviet Union lifted it. But it was indeed enough for the world to realize that this threat from the Soviet Union was not just on paper, it was more than truly real. And therefore, in the same year, a military political bloc, NATO, was formed from 12 countries in Europe and North America. Why? To protect Europe from possible expansion by the Soviet Union. And no one cared about the Potsdam agreements anymore. Therefore, the Western occupation zones of Germany were transformed into a separate state, the Federal Republic of Germany. And in response to this, the Soviet Union turns its occupation zone into the German Democratic Republic. And so, Germany transforms into two different states, and an experiment begins that you couldn't make up on purpose. The FRG is following a capitalist path, while the GDR is building socialism. So, what do you think will happen if you divide one nation with the same cultural and historical values into two different countries? But that's exactly what happened in Germany. The eastern part began to live under socialism. German farmers were forced to join cooperatives, and business owners to meet production plans, and students to also learn the basics of Marxism-Leninism. Now imagine such innovations being imposed against your will when you have lived in market conditions and relative freedom for the past decades. And here, the ruling Socialist Party of East Germany, in an effort to increase production, is proposing to increase production quotas with the following wording. The government of the German Democratic Republic welcomes the workers' initiative to increase production standards. It thanks all the dedicated and hardworking workers who have increased their standards for their tremendous and significant patriotic effort. At the same time, it addresses the workers' demands for the revision and increase of standards. The salaries remained the same, but people had to work more. People didn't like this, and strikes began at the factories. Within a couple of weeks, they grew into large-scale demonstrations not only in Berlin, but throughout East Germany. And to suppress them, Soviet tanks had to be brought in along with a state of emergency. The uprising was eventually suppressed, but people began to vote with their feet. In just the first 10 years of the GDR's existence, thanks to its totalitarian policies, every 10th resident fled the country. To prevent brain drain, checkpoints appear on the border between the GDR and the FRG, and special permits are introduced for travel to border zones. And now you can't easily travel to visit relatives in another region, and the Iron Curtain is becoming increasingly tangible. But people still had one loophole, through Berlin. You could easily travel to West Berlin, get on a train there, and go to the FRG. Thanks to this route, even with closed borders in 1956, almost 280,000 Germans fled to West Germany. It seemed that stopping this migration was simply impossible. But in 1962, something probably happened, and you probably already guess what it is. You know, that year, the number of escapees sharply decreased by 10 times. This was because, in reality, for many months, the head of the East German government, Walter Ulbricht, bombarded the Soviet leadership with letters in which he persuaded them to build a wall in the center of the city. And not only because people are running into the arms of capitalism, but also because the entire capital is teeming with spies, and NATO missiles are already installed in the western part of the city. And although in public statements Ulbricht says that there is no talk of building a wall, on August 12, 1961, the Council of Ministers of the GDR decrees, to prevent hostile activities by forces from West Germany and West Berlin, the same control will be introduced at the border of the German Democratic Republic, as is customary at the borders of every sovereign state. And so, early in the morning on Sunday, August 13, 1961, police supervised as concrete slabs with barbed wire were installed at the border between the two parts of the city. In some places, one side of the street was in the eastern city, while the other side was in the western city. As a result, the doors and windows of houses facing West Berlin were simply and completely bricked up and boarded over. In just 3 days, the border was surrounded with barbed wire. No one could simply cross from east to west except through checkpoints and by train, with official government permission. And over the next few upcoming years, this wall transformed from a concrete fence into a massive 160-kilometer-long border strip with watchtowers and alarms. And this wall divided not only families, but also the economies of two ideologies, becoming a true symbol of the communist threat for the Western world. To understand this, look at how the President of the United States, John Kennedy, was received in West Berlin during the wall's construction.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin.
If we compare how people lived in East Germany and West Germany after the war today, we will see that the standard of living in West Germany, measured by GDP, was about twice as high, and this gap persisted for the following decades. In front of you is a map of heavy industry in East Germany in the 1960s. Each circle represents a city which produces something, and the larger the circle, the greater the volume of production. Now, take a look at the industry in West Germany. a vast variety of completely different and absolutely diverse industries. There are several figurative Berlins here, and of course workers came here en masse for work before the Berlin Wall was erected. We see the same kind of gap in the light industry. While the GDR had a couple of dozen cities where enterprises were being converted to a planned economy, the map of the FRG is indeed literally filled with companies as they are competing with each other. This explains the GDP gap. West Germany produced and consumed significantly more and substantially more than East Germany, and every sector, from mining to furniture production in East Germany, was half the size of its Western counterpart, and every industry was half the size of its Western counterpart. Everyone was moving to West Germany, workers and companies. For example, a giant like Siemens moved its headquarters from Berlin to Munich as early as 1949. And being in a competitive environment, Western enterprises invested in development, updated machinery, and improved production. Earlier, I mentioned that street lighting in Berlin is different. This is because the Soviet part used inexpensive and cheap sodium lamps which emit yellow and warm light. In the western part of Berlin, more economical but more modern and expensive cold light halogen lamps were indeed certainly used. Just to give you an idea of the scale, in the 1950s, investments in fixed assets in West Germany were 6 times greater than in East Germany. And when West Germany joined the European Economic Community in 1957, the precursor to the future European Union, Western companies gained access to a vast European market for their goods and the attraction of labor. Now, Western German companies could certainly and indeed freely trade with other European countries without any tariffs or restrictions. Finally, small business owners also tried to move to West Germany because, as you can understand, doing business under socialism was impossible. And all these actions collectively kick-started the economy of the devastated West Germany, which quickly emerged as a European leader. A few years, the average salary of workers in West Germany increased by 20%, and the volume of production quadrupled. Meanwhile, the economy of East Germany was also growing, but in a completely different way. The GDR was put on a planned economy track and began to restore its heavy industry, which had been destroyed during the war and partially taken to the Soviet Union as reparations. At the same time, the new technologies that were available to West Germany from the Allies were not present in East Germany because there was nowhere to obtain them. However, the legacy of German industry was so solid that despite the outcomes of the war and the flight of companies to the West, the GDR still indeed became the main supplier of industrial equipment to communist countries, significantly. While companies in West Germany followed a competitive path, in East Germany firms were nationalized and merged into large conglomerates. Naturally, such a centralized system allowed for better control economic sectors, but there could be no talk of competition. The combines simply turned into monopolists. The most interesting thing is how people lived in such different economies. See the annual salaries of residents of West Germany and East Germany in the late 1980s. An East German earned 1,200 East German marks, while a West German earned 3,800 West German marks. If you also account for the exchange rate, the salary of a West German was approximately 20 times higher, but to compare living standards, you need to look not at the numbers, but at real wages, meaning how many goods and services you can buy with that money. And here is what you could buy with 100 marks in the West and in the East at that time. It turns out that the basket of a West German was almost half the size because high salaries came with high prices, while in East Germany, prices were kept low and part of the expenses was covered by the state. For the same 100 marks in East Germany, you could send a child to daycare for a month, while in West Germany, it would only cover a week. And the Federal Chancellor of Germany in the early 1960s, Ludwig Erhard, said, "The state should provide social assistance according to the moral standards of society, if it concerns truly needy people, but at the same time support competition and fight against dependency attitudes." Meanwhile, in the GDR, everything was completely different. Free education, kindergartens, and universities where everyone received a scholarship resulted in 90% of the female population of East Germany having jobs by the end of the existence of the GDR, and a third of East Germans having higher education. However, the downside of socialism and a planned economy was the limited assortment and even shortage of consumer goods, from clothing and furniture to household appliances and cars. For example, buying a car was cheaper in the GDR, but you would have to wait in line, And while by the 60s, 3 to 7% of people in the FRG already had a car, in the GDR, they only reached half of that figure by the 70s. While in the Soviet Union there were 2 KGB officers per 1,000 residents, in East Germany there were about 6 intelligence officers. And approximately every 50th citizen in East Germany cooperated with the secret police of the GDR, the Stasi, which had a file on almost every resident of the country. In other words, East Germans literally lived in an atmosphere of total control and paranoia. To give you an idea of the scale of the Stasi's work, in the 1970s, an East German spy was the chief advisor to the Chancellor of West Germany, the main figure in West Germany. For approximately 2 decades, Western intelligence could not determine what the head of the Stasi, Markus Wolf, looked like. This was because Berlin was the epicenter of the clash between communism and the West, and the best spies were needed here. West Germany had intelligence services, the CIA, Federal Intelligence Service. West Germans did not feel total control. Against this backdrop, West Berlin certainly looked like paradise, and people risked their lives just to escape from the Soviet zone. And during the nearly 30-year history of the Berlin Wall, more than 140 people died trying to reach the West. At the same time, there were indeed no recorded fatalities of people trying to cross from west to east. By the 1980s, an entire generation of Germans had indeed been born and raised in a country truly divided by a 3-meter wall, undoubtedly. But by this time, the Soviet Union was already rapidly weakening, and the faster this happened, the thinner the border between the GDR and the FRG became. By the early 1980s, aid from the Soviet Union ceased, and East Germany took loans from West Germany, understanding reunification was imminent, making it necessary to establish connections. In gratitude for financial assistance, East Germany simplified issuance of permits for crossing the border, and one of the harbingers of change for the Germans in 1987 was David Bowie's concert in West Berlin near the Brandenburg Gate, which was just a few steps away from the Berlin Wall. East Germans gathered at the wall in massive, huge crowds to listen to this concert, and the police just simply couldn't disperse such a large number of people anymore. Starting in the summer of 1989, mass protests began across East Germany, reaching their peak by the fall. And on November 4th, 1989, 500,000 people gathered at Alexanderplatz, the central square of Berlin. This was East Germany's largest demonstration, and no one to disperse it, as in 1953. In 1953, there was no one. And just 5 days later, a live broadcast by the representative of the ruling party, Günter Schabowski. He meant to say that now everyone will be able to get visas and it will be much easier, but he is being misunderstood.
Also Privatreisen nach dem Ausland können ohne Vorliegen von Voraussetzungen, Reiseanlässe und Verwandtschaftsverhältnisse beantragt werden. Die Genehmigung werden kurzfristig erteilt. Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort.
People hear something different. They think that now the government is actually permitting free travel to West Germany. Indeed. News channels immediately pick up this message, and hundreds of thousands of people quickly begin to gather at the Berlin Wall, all eagerly demanding passage to West Berlin in large numbers. It was physically impossible to contain this crowd. People rushed through the checkpoints and began to break down the wall. And thus, the main symbol of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain fell. And after a brief hesitation, all 4 victorious countries of World War II gave their consent to the reunification of Germany. Same time, Moscow didn't oppose the choice of the Germans and withdrew Soviet troops from the GDR. On October 3rd, 1990, the GDR became part of the FRG, and Berlin once again became the capital of the new state. However, not everything was so rosy. By the early 90s, East Germany had the highest GDP per capita among all Eastern Bloc countries and was growing at the same rate as West Germany. However, by 1989, the GDR was still a developing country with a focus on industry, while the FRG could already be called a developed country, where service industries predominated, meaning it was simply at the next stage of economic development. And while West Germany was the largest trading partner after the Soviet Union, trade with the GDR was not as significant. East Germany did not even rank among the top 10 trading partners of the FRG. And when the euphoria passed, 16 million East Germans found themselves in a new reality. Just remember the graph showing the number of refugees from East Germany? As soon as the wall fell, thousands rushed to the West for a better life. The numbers were like before the borders closed in 1952. More than 300,000 refugees, mostly young working-age people who fled, causing Eastern enterprises to suffer, approximately. This unification simply killed the economy of the East. Firstly, a single currency was introduced. The Western and Eastern marks were equated 1-to-1, although previously one Western German mark was worth 5 Eastern marks. And this led to products from the GDR, which were less competitive, now competing with products from West Germany, where businesses had been surviving in the fight for customers for the past few decades. In the end, only a few managed to maintain their independence and adapt to the market economy. For example, the largest automobile plant in East Germany, which also assembled BMW cars, could not compete with Western companies and was forced to sell to Opel so that employees could at least keep their jobs. And after all, cars are what Germany is famous for. BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Audi, they are known all over the world. And where are most of these brands' factories located today? That's right, in the territory of the former FRG. Everywhere you look, the Postal Service, DHL, Nivea Cosmetics, Adidas, Puma, Bosch, and other German companies and brands, where are all their headquarters? Correct, in West Germany. Therefore, today Germany is united only on paper. Here is a map of GDP per capita. Where are the lowest values? In the East. And the youth go to study and work in the West, where there are more jobs and better pay. It creates a vicious cycle. Less workforce, less production and consumption, lower standard of living. And yes, investments are coming to East Germany. For example, not long ago, Tesla built a huge factory in the suburbs of Berlin. But the difference between the West and the East, created over decades by the Iron Curtain, is still visible to the naked eye. And no matter which economic indicator we take, East Germany today will be overwhelmingly losing to the Western lands, from population growth and aging to unemployment rates and the number of successful companies. So even though the Berlin Wall was indeed torn down more than 30 years ago, it still, in fact, most certainly divides the unified Germany into two entirely and utterly different parts with invisible lines,